Thanks to everyone who's letting us know that you can hear us. And we do want to say thank you for being here on our first day of Latin American and Caribbean chapters. I think we have quite a lot of people here today with us, with Nancy and Christian first talking about global strategies of internet society. Now we're going to be talking about critical properties of the internet. And then in the next sessions that we have the following days, I hope you stay with us too. Yes, in this session in particular is very much connected to what we were saying while we were discussing strategic goals, because as I told you several times, and then even during your questions, I told you that we would be discussing this further into detail. In this presentation is really the big hitter of the afternoon. Diego, I think you can hear us? Yes, I can hear you. Can you all hear me? Yes, we can. Okay, so having introduced your presentation and just in time, we are recording. Diego, Paula, we can get started. Okay, Gris. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm sorry for having issues with my audio. I don't know what was going on, but I was having issue hearing you. I hope you can all see my screen. My name is Diego Canabarro. I work on public policies in the region, and it is a pleasure to me to be here today with you. Tell you a bit more about our internet way of networking that has led us to develop an internet impact assessment toolkit. And we will be assessing the impact of policies on the internet. And this was developed by Christian um, in the project called Internet Way of Networking. Um, we have another name for it in Spanish, as Christian was mentioned as well. Here I am with Paula Corte. She is our consultant for the internet way of networking. And for today, we presented a session focused on doing practical work. What we want is to see how we can use our toolkit in how to use the concepts of the internet way of networking, because we want to share with you what you can do using all the material and all the resources that we've developed this year to support our promotion and defense activities that Christian had mentioned in the previous session. So let's very briefly introduce the internet way of networking. And then after that, we are going to try to simulate a case study on filtering or blocked content online, and we will need you guys to participate there quite actively. And if I recall, this was actually one of the topics that someone asked about in the previous session. So let's get started. First, let me explain where we got this idea of having a particular toolkit to promote and defend the internet way of networking. So as we all know, internet is a mosaic that is made up of 70,000 different networks, and around those networks there are many services, applications, corporate, individual, public, private users. And all of these elements make up a very complex ecosystem, a living organism that is constantly changing and evolving. And this evolution of the internet ecosystem does not follow a certain plan, it does not have centralized control. So the internet users, whether they are individuals, corporations, are not just passive technology users. They shape and they direct the evolution of this ecosystem. It is not just technology then that defines the internet, but it's also the way in which we connect, to each other. It is the way in which local networks are organized and directed. It is the way in which we organize technology, implement protocols, design public policies and governance regulations for the system, the way in which we regulate underlying technologies behind internet, and how we develop apps based on the internet. And that's all because there are very positive and very negative forces that are influence the development of the internet. And because of that, we identified the need to create a framework to assess network management practices, the way in which apps and services are managed, which are the public policies that we have, and all of this we do to see whether or not they do the internet good or bad. And throughout the world, and I'm sure that many of you know this, there are network creation models that are arising that restrict interconnection, that block certain access to certain parts of the internet for local population and communities, or for foreign people, and they seek to create an internet in a way that it is based on permits provided by the government and in a way that limits the global reach and scope of the internet that, as Christian was mentioning, we seek to have. And we've seen actions by commercial stakeholders that are really significant on the structure of the internet that undermine the idea of an open, secure, trusty, interoperable network everywhere. And within that context, we asked ourselves something, which is whether or not, if in order to create or intervene the environment in any way, is it necessary to assess the impact of that? Well, if the answer is yes, if we need to assess the impact that building something has on the ecosystem, why not do the same with the internet ecosystem? And so what we wanted to do with this process was to create resources and tools that any interested party might use to promote and defend the internet way of doing things, and for us to be able to identify strengths and developments that are strong and positive or negative for the network. And that led us to ask ourselves how we could support decision makers in the private and the public sectors, in technical communities too, so that their actions might align to our mission, which is to have a global internet for everyone, everywhere, and to have internet that allows for everyone to communicate and innovate without the need to ask anyone permission to do that. And we wanted for that to happen now, but also in the future. And based on the question, we thought of two steps. First, we needed to define the compendium of elements that make internet be what it is today, and they are the engines that maximize the benefits of internet. And then after that, we needed to develop a set of resources that was really very, very simple and help us evaluate and assess whether or not the technical, political, and regulation changes might affect the groundwork and the foundations of the internet that would be the essential or critical properties of the internet way of networking. So there are basically endless opportunities for us to use internet as a force for good. We can use technology and specific business models in the broadest internet ecosystem might disappear or not, but the internet way of networking, people, users, and networks have been the foundation for the success of the internet from the beginning. And while we were internally discussing this topic, we studied the history and the characteristics of the internet and its development, and we talked about this with our community over months and months. We talked about how it was created and developed. We were able to identify a set of elements that define the internet way of networking. And actually, we created a document that you see here that lays the groundwork for everything we would do after that. What we were able to do here with the support of our community as well, and we started doing this in August last year, was identify a minimal set of basic uh, properties that have to do with the theoretical or conceptual um, way of doing things on internet. So based on that, it was possible for us to create a reference point that enables us to do whether or not the things that are developed around the internet are either making us come closer or be farther away from internet's ideal version. And here in this slide, you can see the 5 essential properties of this internet way of networking, which is basically the fact that internet is based on an infrastructure that is accessible to everyone, that uses a common protocol, that's the TCP and IP family, that it is of free adoption and has very, very few implementation barriers. So an internet user that wants to develop an app does not need to ask, are other users using the same protocol as I am? Or can I access, I don't know, the section of internet where Nancy is or where Chris is from my part of the internet? In the second place, internet has an open architecture that is made up of interoperable parts that can be reused for anything you want. So an app developer doesn't have to start from scratch and wonder about the underlying infrastructure, because the internet architecture offers many options for quick implementation, which is actually allows for the creation of interoperable services that are innovative without the need to ask every single part and member of the internet ecosystem for permission, or to ask for permission to every single layer that make up this network. Now, because of its global scope and outreach, it is very important to have an internet that is decentralizedly managed and has a single distributed routing system that is shared by all of its members. So we will talk a bit more into detail about this single distributed routing system in other sessions of this workshop. But the idea is that offers a resilient, adaptable network, which enables us to use it locally, and for us to provide maintenance work in that particular point in order to safeguard the remainder of the network. And that also enables users to choose the best connectivity for their needs. Internet also has a common global identifiers system, which provides a coherent vision of the entire network. And that actually guarantees that data flow is organized, and it enables us to identify where teams are without any fragmentation. So this is an end-to-end identification. And then finally, the last property of the internet way of networking is that we have a network that is a general purpose network, and that is technology neutral and scalable. It can be used for any ends whatsoever. It does not require significant changes or modifications to have new services or apps. And many of you who are as old as I am perhaps might know that the services that we use now for video calls have significantly changed throughout the years, but the internet infrastructure remains practically as it was in the beginning. So those essential properties, those 5 essential properties that we have, if we consider them in isolation, do not guarantee all the benefits of the internet way of networking. And this internet way of networking, when it considers these five properties, creates conditions which are the necessary conditions that make internet a positive force for the development of economy, of societies, um, and cultures as well. So, if you will, this is the design of the internet that you have here in the slide. And it is possible for each of these principles or properties to be attacked in isolation. And that's what we will see now. So, if we understand the critical properties of the internet way of networking, we can analyze, for example, regulations, proposals of regulations or proposals of technological developments of certain private operators based on the impact, whether it be negative or positive, that they might have on those essential properties. And that might help us as a community and as organizations to explain our perspectives, preoccupations, concerns, and perceptions about the health of the internet throughout the world. And in order for us to see how we can use this framework, what we have now are three practical case studies that help us compare real life matters with the concept of the internet way of networking. We have a case that has to do with routing practices in countries such as China, Russia, and even United States, with the case of TikTok and the Clean Network program, where we will be evaluating how the reduction of autonomy in networks in these countries might lead to the reduction of the global scope of the internet and block certain areas of the internet to local populations and create roadblocks to have an open global internet. Then we have a case study for the forced data localization in a country that highlights the negative effect that these obligations have for innovation because, for example, they imply that the operator cannot store data at any stage of the topology of the network that might be more beneficial for his economic condition. Because if we remember that internet is a global network and we should be able to store data anywhere within the network that is most useful for us. And of course, that connects to the responsibility of intermediaries, which we'll be talking about on Wednesday. And then finally, what is the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, you might be wondering? Basically, it's the set of resources that were created thanks to the Internet Way of Networking project. So the document that creates and provides those principles of the internet way of networking, and then the cases that explain how the concepts and the essential principles are used to evaluate events or facts at a local level. So if any of us wants to conduct similar analysis to the ones that we're doing with the cases that we have today can do it. So I encourage you to check out these materials so that you can use them, evaluate them, and intervene in the processes of your country at at a local level in order to defend the internet where you are. But I think I've said a lot. So now I want to focus on an exercise to talk about something that really has a lot to do with the health of the network, that is the filtering and the blocking of content in the internet. What we are doing, particularly what the staff is doing right now, is to create a new case study based on the filtering and the blocking of content. This case study will be ready, as we will explain later on, for publication by the end of 2020. But we did decide to bring the case here to discuss it with you so that we can get feedback and we can also talk more about this. So now Paula will have the floor and she will ran and moderate our discussion based on this practical case of blocked content.
Bueno, ¿me escuchan bien?
Can everyone hear me?
Espero que sí, pero
Okay, I hope you can.
muchas buenas noches. Bueno,
So, good afternoon,
el
depending
día de
on where
hoy
you
voy
guys
a
are.
hablar
My name is
contigo
Paula
sobre
Cortarreal. As Diego
networking en
said,
el aire,
I am an
específicamente
Internet Society
en Digital
consultant,
Way of Networking, en este
especially with regards
nuestro
to the Internet way of networking
y
that Diego was
ahora
presenting.
vamos a proponer
And
un
now I
tema
will be proposing,
sobre ok, se escucha bien, muy bien.
yes, everyone can hear me perfect. I will
Una
be
simulación
proposing a simulation or a hypothetical case
sobre lo que
so that
dijo
you can
Diego
reflect a
sobre
bit more on what Diego mentioned
las 5 propiedades
regarding
clave
specifically the
del
5
portfolio de
essential
información para el impacto
principles of the critical
para la
properties
plataforma
of Internet and the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. Can you move to the next slide, please?
si puede pasar
Next slide, please.
Paula,
Paula, Diego can't hear us, I think. Um, do you have the same presentation so we can enable you
sí,
to
sí lo
share your
tengo.
screen? Yes, I do have it.
Ahí está.
Oh, wait, great. It's working now.
Ahora
Brilliant.
perfecto. Entonces, la idea es simplemente
So, the
utilizar
idea
este escenario
simply
hipotético para pensar un
is for
poco
us to
sobre
think of this hypothetical
estas cinco
scenario
propiedades que Diego
that will allow us to think
presentado.
more about these
Entonces,
5
supongamos
properties. So, the cases that you and your
que la
team have just
alternativa
been asked to
de
offer a
respuesta
very
es la
brief
siguiente.
emergency informative session
Porque ella acaba de
to an
recibir
old
una lista de comunicación.
college
Se le ha
friend.
pedido que elabore
She
una
has just
respuesta
been called
internacional
the
para identificar
communications minister, and the president has asked her to urgently create a national plan to filter content. But the Ministry of Justice and Security wants to take control of this process. So your friend wants to present a solid case in favor of open internet, but she wants to base her case on concrete analysis, and she wants to explain how this filtering can affect the internet now and in the future. So this would be a hypothetical case that can explain how the block can affect the internet. And we need to do this based on the properties that Diego explained and think about the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. So we created this hypothesis in order for us to reflect as to whether or not the filtering and blocking of content can affect the Internet and its specific properties. So before we specifically talk about how this can affect those 5 essential properties that we were mentioning, let's talk about what it means to block or filter content and what we can do about this. So I'm going to be talking a bit about this with Christian and Diego and whomever wants to participate as well, because we do have a document. It is an Internet Society document that is very detailed, and it discusses the technical aspects of content blocking, how it is conducted, who conducts it, from a technical perspective at least. This is a really interesting document that is available and has been available since 2017, but it remains current because these are techniques that are used and have been used for a very long time. And because I don't have a lot of time, I'm going really fast and I can't really present the document. You can check it online. And then I will also be a bit more informal, sharing with you. Oh, wait a second. I think Diego is having issues. He can't hear anything, but okay, it doesn't matter. I can go on then, and I can talk to Christian. Can everyone hear me? Yes, everyone can hear you just fine. Okay, then, so let's start with Christian. Christian, could you explain to us why our content's blocked normally? Because in this area, we've seen, at least in our hypothetical case, uh, the control of content is done at a national level many times, but we would like to know how this blocking is conducted and what are the reasons behind requesting this kind of blocks. Maybe you could explain this a bit more, Christian? Yes. Going back to Diego's presentations, content blocking can be done in different points in different places. When we block content in our homes, that is our decision, and we as users can decide what things do users have access to in our homes, and that is not wrong. Companies also do that, and companies might decide what is the kind of content that they want their employees to have access to. The problem is what happens when content blocking happens at a massive level and an internet provider decides that his or her clients and users may or may not have access to certain parts of the network. So when this is done at the level of the provider, this has a double impact. On the one hand, this is about censorship, but this is also a commercial issue because they're not providing their services fully or entirely. So there it is really easy to do something about this because they are in non-compliance with their obligation. The problem is what happens when the provider is told to generate that content block. And that is when all those possibilities come into place regarding to how to implement the content block. Because whomever mandates this content block might explain in detail how to do this. However, that will not be effective because if you are told that you need to do content blocking using DNS, what you are telling providers is to do something that they might not be able to do because of the DNS service that solves the names is not implemented at the provider level. The provider might not be able to do that, or if they tell you to filter a particular package and the equipment of the provider cannot do that, then it doesn't work. So most of the times instructions are not that detailed, right? So the instructions would not necessarily be specific, and they're more like, okay, don't allow access to this website. And that also brings complications because if the provider decides to filter the IP address of that website, they will not just be filtering that content, but also all the websites that are posted using that IP address. And that is not what the authorities asked either. And that would also not be in compliance with the service that they need to provide users because all the other websites should be accessible. So there are many complications that arise when we try to implement a particular content block. There are no solutions that work all the time, not from the side of the operator and not from the side of the authority. So that is an issue when we're trying to execute blocks. Diego, can you hear us? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, sure. We can. Okay, yes. Could you hear what Chris said? Yes, I could. I did want to I want to call your attention to what Chris was saying, which has to do with the fact that a block can be applied in a very, very specific way or in a very generic way. When we're blocking a particular document in a website, that's really specific. But when we are blocking certain connections that use the HTTPS protocol, security protocol, um, or any other particular website is too generic, and that actually leads to too many false positives because that block affects even communication flows that are legitimate. And basically, even if we go beyond the technical problems that arise from filtering or content blocking, um, cause for infrastructure layers, it is also important for us to mention that blocking also generates legal issues for the authorities or adopting them. That was actually the case that is very well known of Brazil when a judge ruled that WhatsApp should be blocked throughout Brazil, and that happened in 2 days. And what was registered there was that there were secondary side effects in neighboring countries. And that caused a legal issue for Brazilian authorities because Brazilian authorities are now carrying out actions in their own territory that interfere with the territory of neighboring countries. And according to international law, that interference is not justifiable. So, having said that, taking things out of the internet because they infringe upon laws is legitimate from the perspective of authorities. We do need to bear in mind that this is a very complex topic at the technical, political, and legal aspects, but we are generating possibly problems for an undefined number of users or networks, or for an undefined number of countries. Because, of course, internet has a wide global scope.
Bueno, genial. Yo creo que
Yes.
algo que
Okay.
mencionaste
Great. And I think, Diego, what you just said about
es muy importante
the
porque
notion of prohibition is important because we have this idea of the internet as a global network. So if I am making a decision in my country, I might be affecting other countries too. Apart from technical issues, I might be creating legal issues as well. And now, could the two of you tell us a bit more about the specific content blocking techniques? How do those blocks take place? Because maybe I would say, I'm sorry, our website is down at the moment. Everyone's saying that this is a paradox, and it is a pity that our site is down right now. I'm sure that it will be up and running just now. But do remember that you have a link over there, and once it's working, you can access the documents that you were mentioning. But I'm sorry for this. Anyway, going back to what we were discussing, Diego and or Chris, could you say a bit more about how those content blocks are carried out, at least from a technical perspective, and connect them, if you will, whether we're talking about an IP block or DNS blocking, and explain this a bit more and tell us how it works? Yes, this is related to the implementation that we were discussing at the beginning. A very low level block that might have to do with the routing of packages, might have to do with ruling out all traffic leading to an IP address. So if we are operating a certain network and we don't want users to uh, get to a certain IP address, what we can do is just send all traffic to null. So we are routing to null all traffic leading to that IP address. So by doing that, no user going through that network, either clients of their own or connected clients going through that network, will be able to get to that IP address. That would be the lowest level filtering, and that rules out all traffic to that address. Then, as operators, we might be able to filter packages that are leading to that IP address or that have a certain protocol or certain port or certain information. For example, if what we're trying to filter, as Diego was saying, were voice conversations using a certain traffic, the operator might use a filter in an interface to filter all the packages that come from a particular protocol, such as a UDP protocol, to a certain destiny. That package filter can be done through an interface, so it's not as massive as the one that I mentioned before. It's not that no one in the network can get to that IP. It's just those that go through a particular interface will be affected. Even we could choose not to do this over the entirety of the traffic. We could even do it for a certain protocol, a certain port. Then, if we have additional tools, we might choose to filter based on the content of the packages, uh, such as Paula was mentioning, deep packet inspection, right? It's not the information of the header of the package, but rather information that is deep within the package. The problem is that those particular tools enable us to go more into detail. This is not gross filtering affecting any package leading to an IP address. We need tools to discriminate exactly what we're filtering. But the problem then is that this becomes more costly every time, and it has an even greater impact on the network when we go so much into detail, because the only information available for the equipment is the header. The only thing the equipment does is look at the IP address and send traffic through an interface. But if we ask them to filter with addition based on additional decisions, we are loading those equipments with additional tasks. And if on top of that we are not just asking them to filter it based on a particular aspect of the protocol, but we want to look at the content of the packages as well. We need a particular equipment that does that, and to make all the traffic in our network go through there. So we are making our network less robust and more complex, while we also enable it to filter things at a more detailed level. So, because of how internet works, implementing filtering systems is very complex, and there are no scalable solutions to properly filter data. And as a matter of fact, the definition of what it is to filter something correctly is arguable. So, from the technical point of view, anything that implies filtering from an operator's network makes for a very complex operation.
Perfecto. Muy bien.
Perfect
Creo que
then.
nos dio un poco de la idea de
Christian
lo,
then was
la perspectiva
explaining
técnica
more
de lo
about
que
the
es
technical
filtrar
perspective,
y
but
validar
maybe Diego would like to tell us a bit
las
more about the
intenciones
reasons
legítimas que se puede hacer
or the
desde el
legitimate
lado
reasons
del
behind
usuario, de quien
carrying out a
quiere
filtering or a content
implementar la
blocking,
perspectiva
maybe just
jurídica en este sentido.
considering the legal and policy
Comentó
aspects
un poco
of the
sobre
filtering and the
los
block. And
varios
maybe you want to talk a bit more about side
podemos
effects
aplicar también
too,
desde
so that we can move on. Yeah, sure. From the perspective of public policies, what we've seen in our region is that there are a great number of justifications behind blocking or filtering. I think one of the easiest arguments that people pose, or the most common arguments that people pose, are connected to child abuse and child pornography. Another topic that is quite common in the countries of our regions have to do with online gaming. They have to do with access to hate speech content. Recently, they have a lot to do with fake news and disinformation. And there are many other aspects, and I'm not here to say whether they're legitimate or not. I'm talking simply about the region, the reasons that we've heard in the region requesting those blocks. And if we go a step further, there are certain countries that say that telecommunications have to do with national sovereignty. They are connected to national sovereignty, and that we need to have cybernetic virtual borders, and the public authorities need to connect the inflow and the outflow of information, the virtual information of their countries. And they actually do this by directly controlling and monitoring what network operators can do with regards to interconnection and routing. And recently in the United States, wanted to clean its network. So the government asked network operators to guarantee that their internet connections do not go through any Chinese networks. We know, for example, that China also uh, imposes roadblocks or virtual boundaries, if you will, to internet in their country at least. And in a way, this closes or restricts internet in certain parts of the world. And that creates issues because data flow uh, has to take a certain predetermined route, and that breaks the plurality and the diversity of pathways that are available for people to connect to the internet. And another important matter here, and this is something that Chris was explaining also, is that when content is blocked based on an IP address, for example, we should consider that an IP address might refer to a certain machine where we have two or three servers of different nature. Um, that particular block can happen too with a DNS server. So if someone says that there is illicit or illegal material on the Internet Society website and they block our domain, they block the .org domain. What happens with the DNS resolution charts to translate those numbers and those names? It is possible that depending on the scope of the block, our personal emails at isoc.org cease to work. So it might be not just that we won't have access to the contents of the Internet Society because someone identified that there was a picture in a report on community networks in another place with another URL, but with the same domain of Internet Society. And because of that, we will cease to have access to all of our material. So it is possible for that to happen. It is also possible for there to be multiple reasons to implement a block. And it is hard to implement it and to do the right block. I don't know if you want to add something else, Chris. Yes, I want to answer some of the questions that I'm reading over here that are related to this. The question would be whether or not it might be useful to do pen testing, which is a tool that has to do with what is the level of penetration, right? And many of those pen tools enable us to find weaknesses that might perhaps avoid the block. And in reality, no block is 100% effective. And in the end, what happens is that if we want to block access to a lot of people, those people that we want to block the access to end up finding a way to bypass our block. I think I was mentioning blocks at the level of network equipments or maybe at the name resolution level. But what happens here is that it's possible that if we implement that block, the DNS server won't allow us to access. But that is actually a really simple block to bypass. If we know the IP address of the server that we want to get to, we might very easily to avoid the block by just changing the resolution. And I know that there are similar examples at many levels. I mean, if the block is conducted based on deep packet inspection, we could create an encrypted tunnel and thus avoid the block. So I think the issue here is that blocking is in no way a solution to problems. And I think that we need to think of what the solution for the problem that is a cause for concern might be together. And then the second thing would be whether or not making our networks less robust make them more insecure. And yeah, I mean, in a way it does, because if we force traffic into only one pathway, we're creating a critical pathway, but we're also creating a vulnerable pathway. Because if someone has access to that place, they will have access to the entire traffic of the network. And that, of course, renders it vulnerable. Or if the entire name resolution goes through one particular server that is implemented for a block, then that service implementation might also be abused and used for malicious purposes. So, in a way, yes, that might cause insecurity in the network. And then I think that there was another question about fake news. What was it? Okay, wait. It is whether or not it's necessary to block things. Maybe I can answer that if you want. Yeah, you go ahead. Blogs are happening all the time because if you think about it, social networks are like clubs where everything that we have there is based on specific rules. We have content moderation rules as well. And the responsibility of intermediaries is kind of connected to this if you think about it. And as a matter of fact, there are court orders or out of court orders that request social network providers to block and filter online content. And this, of course, is connected to accountability and to transparency, I would say. But the main issue is that within social networks, depending on how the block is requested and then implemented, if it is implemented, we might cause damages for the entirety of the social network and all of its users just because we want to remove one post or one image. So beyond that particular content, if I don't know, if we are blocking or if we ask the DNS solvers not to solve facebook.com, then all the emails of the Facebook employees who are carrying out legitimate activities might not be able to carry them out anymore. So these are very complex cases, and social networks in particular need to specifically identify content and remove the content individually without actually do anything in connection to IP addresses or to domain names. They need to use specific URLs for content, which is, I think, simpler to do in social networks than it is anywhere else in the network. Do you want to talk about this, Chris? Yes, I can. Uh, Let me use an analogy to explain an issue. When we have two ends in the network that want to communicate user and content, and the operator or the intermediary in the middle implements a filter so that that connection between those two interested parties, that's a block. Now, when we have an operator who is doing something to protect the user from an attack or an abuse, that is not a block. An example of this would be what happens with a mailing service. If our mailing service provider, Gmail, Outlook, whatever, makes it so that certain emails get to us or not, or for some people to be able to write to us or not, that would be a block. However, when my provider blocks spam and doesn't show it, that is not a wrong block. I mean, it is a block, but it isn't wrong because I have no legitimate interest in getting those emails anyway. The same thing happens if there is an attacker who is attacking using certain IP addresses that are known to be hacker addresses, and my provider is filtering them and preventing them from get to my computer. That's a service. That's not a block. The block is different. Okay, perfect. And just to wrap it up before we actually move into the part where we ask everyone, all our experts in the community to participate, I did want to say that there's a question here that says, is it possible to choose a country not to have access to internet because of political decisions if that country is getting internet services, but because um, of pressure, then internet access is denied to a country? Well, what I would say is that that's a very complex example because countries tend not to depend fully on other countries to access internet. I don't think there are any countries in the world that have so much power over other powers, um, on other countries to give them or not access to internet, because most of the times they share infrastructures. But what could happen though, and this actually does happen, and it's one of the topics that has to do with the shutdowns that Chris was mentioning, is that there are local governments that might have control of the telecommunications layer of the internet of a country, and they might ask those operators to shut down internet or block their international connections. And that happens in certain countries where there are national exams or when there are political events such as elections, and the graphs that we're using to monitor traffic in our countries show that internet was shut down entirely in the country. And that actually happens more at the internal level, or maybe it might happen because of a blackout or an accident, or a shutdown at the infrastructure layer. But I would say that it's really hard to find a country that might be able to shut down the access to internet of another country. Oh, well, thank you, Leo. I think we've answered all the questions, but there is another one in the chat that says that the use block of hotspots, and I'm sorry, but I do have to go really fast here. So the use blocks of hotspots in mobiles by mobile phone operators are cataloged as what? Because they are a strong impediment to access internet from smart TVs, from Internet of Things, homemade devices, from computers. Okay, well, I think we might not see eye to eye here. I think it is the operator's choice whether or not they want to offer certain accesses for the services that they are providing. I mean, they might block use, but I don't think that this is a block that implies an interference in traffic, as we are explaining now. I think this is more connected to the use that the device can make of a particular service. But I mean, someone might not agree with me because I know that this is a very specific question, right? Yes, Chris. Yeah, and not to dwell too much on this, what I would say to everyone in the session is to read this document that you can see here on screen, where that is actually explained that this is more to do with the relationship, the agreement relationship that has to do with the kind of service that we are getting from an ISP or from a mobile operator. And it is more connected to what you see here to the left, where you see the user, because it has to do with things that are implemented on one end or the other. For example, on the device that the user bought, or specifically on last mile networks, but that do not necessarily have to do with the core of the infrastructure of the internet. So those are not blocks, and they more or less depend on the context and on the service provision agreement. So I think at the core of this, you should take that context really is really important. And another thing that I would say, and Karina was saying, is that Mexico is trying to regulate fiscal obligations for the internet service provision. And I think the community, the Mexican community, should use the assessment toolkit, because whether the question of if it's okay that if the ISP does not pay the necessary fee necessary for ingoing and outgoing network packages out of the country, then they cannot send those packages, then I would say we need to assess whether or not that has an impact. I think it's going to be a lot of work for you, and it will be very problematic to have open, secure internet for everyone if you are not able to send packages outside or have packages come in from across the Mexican borders. Um, yes, I think the questions were really interesting. There are more questions over there, but really what we wanted was just to have a conversation and to understand a bit more how we could use the Internet Toolkit in order to assess how to see the impact of the content blocking and content filtering. I know that this is a complex conversation, of course, but the idea was just to see how you were feeling about this, what your idea was, and whether or not you know how to use the impact assessment toolkit. So now going back to the hypothetical case that we were mentioning, let's talk about how you consider these essential properties might be affected in the case of content filtering or content blocking. So here you can see this in the slide. And Nancy, if you can ask these in the pool for everyone so that we can read your opinions about the essential properties and about the possibility of using content filtering, whether or not you think that the properties will be threatened or undermined in that sense. If you think that having filtering or content blocking might affect this first property that has to do with having accessible infrastructure with a common protocol, the answer would be yes, no, or I don't know. I'll give you a moment to answer. Okay, I'll give you a bit more time to answer. You can also comment on this as well if you want to understand this a bit more and see how we can use the framework and this assessment toolkit, because this is the case that, as Diego said, is being internally discussed by the Internet Society staff with regards to the filtering of content and content blocking. So we want to know how our communities feel about this and what they think about this. Oh, and also the website is up and running. So now you can access the document explaining the techniques that Christian and Diego were mentioning, and you can also access the Internet Impact Toolkit. Okay. So we see that most of you said that you feel that the infrastructure is affected. So we can talk about this later on. Let's move to the second question. We had 78% of people saying that they felt that the filtering um, would affect that. Now let's move on to the second one. Does it affect an open architecture of basic interoperable reusable components? So do you think that content blocking and filtering affects the open architecture and the basic interoperable reusable components of the internet? Yes, no, I don't know.
Ya tenemos un 50% casi,
Okay.
llegando al 60% de
We're
gente
getting close
votando.
to 50% of people who voted. Most of you are saying that you believe that content blocking affects the open architecture of the basic components of the internet.
Ya tenemos un resultado
Okay, so the results are really similar here. 78% of you believe that content blocking does affect the open architecture of the internet.
ok.
90%, 19% said it didn't, and 3% said you don't know. Let's go to the next one.
Bueno,
Now, does
el
content blocking and content filtering
sistema
affect the decentralized management and the single distributed routing system of the internet?
¿qué creen ustedes que hace?
Okay, let's see what you think.
A ver,
Remember that we have 5 properties?
72% también
Now,
está
in internet
considerando que la
society, we are
fiscalización de
specifically
contenido
discussing the case of
y les gusta un poco más
content filtering.
cómo lo
And
hacemos
Diego, when we get to the conclusion, will
como día a
explain a bit
día
more what we will be
en
doing.
breve
But
mientras está en
we will
curso
be sharing with
para
you
un caso
the
práctico también que
draft
pueda
that we're
ser
discussing for a
aplicado al
practical
contenido.
case
Y este
study
es un tema muy importante
regarding
para
content
nosotros
filtering. And this is actually
porque
a matter that is really important for our
ejemplo,
region,
el caso de
something
WhatsApp
that happened in Brazil with a case of WhatsApp and other cases of content
podemos
blocks
aplicar
as well that we might
evaluaciones
be able to evaluate and
herramientas de
assess by
evaluación
using the
para
Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit.
ahí se acaba también.
Okay,
Entonces también
let's
tenemos
see
parecido, o sea,
the
el 80
voting. We've got
cree
73%
que
of
sí,
you saying that it would affect it. Then we have 13 saying it doesn't, and then 13 saying you don't know.
cuarta propiedad,
And let's go to
estos son los
property number
indicadores
4 that has to do with the common global identifiers. So, do you believe that the content blocking and content filtering would actually affect common global identifiers? Do you think common global identifiers would be undermined or affected by filtering or blocking content? Yes, no, or I don't know.
la penúltima. Ya seguimos para la última.
And this is actually question number 4. We will have one more
De
question,
caption.
and then we will see how you all assess
Ya
this
tenemos el
generally.
60% de gente votando.
We have about 40% of people who have already voted. In a couple more seconds, we will be wrapping up this question.
Ya. Está un poco menos. Tenemos
Okay, here we have 65% of you who said that it would, 23% who said it wouldn't. This looks a bit different from the previous ones, right? Anyway, let's get to question 5, and that will be the end of our poll. Now, here we have property 5 that implies having a technology neutral general purpose network that provides flexibility and continuously tends to a diverse community. So, do you believe that content blocking would affect this internet property? Yes, no, or maybe you don't know. This is your last question, so please make sure that you vote and you evaluate the results.
perfecto, ya tenemos ahí 60, 70
Great. So
votantes.
70% of participants, give or take, have already answered.
La gente parece que nos está
Um,
también. 75% dijo que
okay, it
sí,
appears that 75% of you said yes,
y 7%
19% of you
que no.
said no, and
Perfecto.
7% of you said that you didn't know.
Ahí está, terminamos ya.
So we
Entonces,
are done now with the poll.
creo que ya se acabó la encuesta. Muchas
Okay,
gracias
so we've
a los que
completed
participaron
that.
y
Thank you
escribieron.
all of you who
Y
participated and
lo importante
contributed with us
es poder
today. And like I
evaluar
said once again, our idea is
experiencias
to
pasadas
assess how
y
you feel
errores
about
en
this
casos prácticos
toolkit
de su
and,
historial de
and
uso
whether or
y
not you think
comprobamos
it
que ahora
applies to this
ya
practical
está,
case
¿verdad?
of content filtering
Dando un
because
case
we
study, un
are
caso práctico
creating
de
a
utilizar
case
el contenido
study
para
specifically
utilizar
on
su
content
propia
filtering
evaluación.
to use the assessment toolkit. So thank you very much for participating. And then let's move to the conclusion. Uh, First, I want to just make a very brief comment, and then I want Diego to take the floor. But what I would say is that there are no 100% right or wrong answers for the questions. This is an assessment, and it will definitely depend on each filtering technique. It will depend on the national, operational, and commercial context too. Diego and Christian presented different cases of how content is blocked. They talked about the reasons why sometimes those blocks are requested. So there are no rights and wrongs here. We have what I would say just a space for us to reflect on this and use the kit. So now Diego has the floor. Maybe he can talk about the conclusion here, Diego.
Bien. A ver, son dos cosas distintas.
Okay, so I would say that there are
Una
two
cosa
different things
es
here.
el caso
Um,
simulado
One
que
thing
hemos
is
conversado
the
y
simulated
ese es
case, the hypothetical
porque
case that
ustedes
we
también
presented to you,
hicieron
and I think
este
it's
caso concreto.
great that
Porque
most of you
obviamente
were
puede
able
implicar,
to see
ustedes van a
that this
tener
might
que
concrete
ver
case might have an
de
impact
manera
on
independiente la
all the
interconexión.
critical properties of the internet way of
Cosa
networking.
que ustedes ven
This conclusion that you have right before you
el caso,
has to do with a case
capítulo que
study
nosotros vamos a
or
enviar a
that
ustedes,
we will be sharing with
se
you
enfoca a solo
that
cuatro
is
partes
focused on
de
just
lo que
four
ese bloque
properties.
puede desempeñar. En
That
términos
is
genéricos,
a protocol, an IP protocol block, the domain server name block, and then the filtering that uses
por eso
deep
en
data
en un esquema
examination.
restrito a estas cuatro
And
partes,
this analysis that is restricted to those kinds of blocks, the draft
para
created an explanation, if you will, for the impacts
a
to
estas
these four
cuatro propiedades esenciales.
properties.
Pero si se recuerdan que
But
Chris
if you remember, Chris did
describe
tell
que
us that it is
existía un bloque
possible
con base en un
to
protocolo
have
específico, el protocolo
a block based
doble
on a
UDP,
specific protocol, such as www
el protocolo
or torrent, or I don't know, the FTP protocol, or the SMTP protocol. So it is likely and probable to be affecting there
de los
the
bloques
um,
reutilizados
the
en
open
distintos
architecture of interoperable and
servicios de
usable
comunicación.
building
Esa es la
blocks
propiedad que
in
nosotros tenemos.
many layers, which is
Dicho
our
esto,
property number two.
decirles que
And what we want to say by this is that, as Paula had mentioned, there are no fully right answers or definite answers for all cases, or for all block events. And every single case and every single proposal and every single rule or regulation might lead to a different kind of answer.
ustedes
If
utilizan el
you
documento base
use
donde
the
explicamos el detalle de cada
foundational
uno de los
document
bloques,
where we
puede
explain the
ser
details of every
que
blocking
los objetivos
technique
de los mismos
from
inicia
parental
con una
control in children's
interconexión
devices
en el nivel del
all the
nodo
way to the
con el proveedor
interconnection
desde el
blocking
punto en el que realiza
carried out by ISPs at the network level.
generar una evaluación de
We
impacto
know that this might
distinta.
lead to a different impact
Lo que vamos a
assessment.
hacer en la secuencia de
And
siguientes
what we will
semanas
be
es
doing
caso
in these sessions
cuyo
is
borrador
share with you the draft
fue
case study that we
adicionado
have right now,
de
so
modo
that you can make
que
comments, so that you can provide your opinions.
sepan
But
que
I think the most important thing is that you know that this entire toolkit is a living thing. It is evolving as our community, as our allies
de
are
uso
creating
de las
more
propiedades
case
esenciales del
studies
Internet
on
federalizado, en
the
este caso,
essential properties of the internet
como por
that
ejemplo
you
publicidad
focus
engañosa,
on
los
topics
impuestos
such as
sin
the ones
sentido,
Karina was mentioning of the
el delito en
taxes and
México,
the internet
las cosas que
service
vamos a
providers in
presentarles ahorita en estas sesiones
Mexico,
sobre fake
for
news
the
en sus
people who are
países
going to be talking about fake news in their countries and about the measures that are being taken in their own
pornografía
countries
infantil,
to combat child
incluso
pornography and other topics as well. So, what we invite you and encourage you to do as members of this community is to continue adding to the corpus that make for this toolkit so that people can understand the impact of technological, political developments in the internet. And then to wrap it up, and because we're over time, I would say that here in this link that you have on screen, we have a form that any of you might complete to let us know whether you are interested in helping us with specific cases that you can detect in your countries, with specific events that you can observe in your countries during 2021. Now, while we are getting over 2020, we will try to identify the people in our regions who might want to help us complete this toolkit with diverse examples of the countries where we have ISOC members. So we will be carrying out many activities around the use and the application of the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. And we hope you help us with this. So we are here at your service if you need anything else. My email is there on the chat, and we are always available to continue talking about these topics with you. Thank you very much, Diego. Once again, because I don't see any questions here in the chat, I want to simply thank you all for joining us this afternoon in the session. I want to also remind you that if you want to validate this session for your participation certificate, you do need to complete the trivia. The trivia has already been shared through the chat. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.